and gentlemen, good morning. It's 10:30 and I think we are ready to start. I'm hoping that all other logistical issues are sorted and that anybody else who's joining is being encouraged to join the session. Welcome to a South African event that is being hosted by the South African Local Government Association, SALGA. It's entitled Just Transition and Climate Finance in Local Government. So with a specificity on local government. I understand that we are joined outside of this room by other people on various platforms. That's quite encouraging. We have a 5-person panel that is quite balanced that will navigate us on this topic of, I suspect, firstly, understanding better the subject matter of just transition, but I think secondly, how do we finance that particular transition within the context of climate change. Before we start, I just want to lay the context as follows. At this morning's briefing, where we were getting an update, we harvested the following as the emerging text from the president of COP28. And I'm going to paraphrase it so as to lay a better context. The president encourages all parties and non-party stakeholders in order to pursue the aspirations outlined in paragraph 8 of the emerging agreement and to increase political ambition and enhance adaptation action and support to, I underline, to accelerate swift action at scale and at all levels, from local to global, in alignment with other global frameworks towards the achievement of inter alia targets that are set in the SDG 2030. And the emphasis here is on adaptation and the acceleration of swift action at scale and at all levels. I'm saying this because we want to anchor this discussion today on that particular emerging conclusion or statement from the president. If we go back to quote the South African Constitution, particularly in terms of how it stipulates the objects of local government, one of the 5 objectives, particularly the last objective, states as follows: local government is to encourage the involvement of communities and community organizations in matters of local government. So in part, the question is, how do we involve communities and community organizations in the subject matter and in the intention of achieving just transition through financing, amongst other things that we will need to do. Today, the purpose of today's session is as follows. Firstly, to develop a collective vision for what financing the just transition could look like in African cities. Cities here is utilized interchangeably to also make reference to municipalities, so as not to give the impression that we are talking only about urban municipalities. So that's the first objective. How can we foster a collective vision? Of course, taking into account the fact that we have the responsibility of mobilizing and ensuring meaningful participation by communities. Secondly, to consider how consensus can be forged amongst whole of government and all of society partners, so as for us to be able to ensure a just and equitable transition. The second objective is to unpack strategies for municipalities and cities can use to mobilize finance. And I think it is for that reason that one of our panelists comes from an institution that is responsible for exactly that particular subject matter, the subject matter of financing all of our developmental objectives. And lastly, as an objective for this session, to interrogate the role that investors can and should play in influencing policy decision-making and governance of investment priorities. So it's quite a big task and a big ask that we're asking of our panelists. As a consequence, I'm gonna call them one by one to come and join us. Let me start with Mohamed Said from the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Thank you very much. A round of applause. He is a climate change specialist in the Climate and Environment Finance Unit of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Thanks for joining us, Mohamed. We really appreciate it. Secondly, followed by Roland Gum. I'm gonna ask you, Roland, to sit right there because I've had to add, yes, my chairs. Your height is advantageous. Thanks, Roland. Roland works as a program manager for socio-ecological transformation at the Rosa Luxembourg. Thanks very much. A round of applause. Thirdly, I'm going to ask Thokozile Zulu to join us. She is with the Nkangala district municipalities in South Africa, a district municipality in Mpumalanga that is very much directly affected by the subject matter of just transition. Thanks very much, Thokozile. As SALGA, we are led by a delegation of political leaders who are also joining us in the panel. The first person that I'm going to ask to join us is Councillor Kenalimang Pukunzi. She is part and parcel of South Africa's presidential climate change as a commissioner representing local government, but importantly, she is also the chairperson of the SALGA National Working Group on Environmental Planning and Climate Resilience. She hails from the Free State Province. Thanks very much, Mayor. And lastly, but also importantly, because she also comes from Mpumalanga, which is the province that is very much directly affected by the subject matter, is the mayor of J.S. Moroka local municipality, Councillor Nomsa Ntsweni. She's the chairperson of the SALGA National Working Group on Environmental Planning and Climate Resilience for the Mpumalanga province. Colleagues, welcome, and welcome to this session. As I indicated, for those people that are in the room and those that are joining us virtually, I am going to allow each and every one of the panelists just to make a 5-minute provocative statement on the subject matter that is under discussion. Mohammed, perhaps let me start with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think from a funding perspective, we see municipalities, cities, obviously in the front line in terms of addressing climate change. And for us, it's imperative, to support and enable municipalities to embed climate resilient interventions, climate adaptation, and of course, support South Africa's NDC targets, in every way. And from our point of view as DBSA, when it comes to climate finance, we've designed specific programs and initiatives targeting municipalities across key sectors. And over the last few years, since our accreditation with the likes of various UNFCCC finance mechanisms, including the Green Climate Fund and the GEF, recognizing that it's not easy to access these funds. I think there's a lot of acknowledgement that it's a challenge to prepare and design concepts and proposals to access climate finance. And we've battled for many years, trying to find the right formula. to support municipalities. And we believe we've got an approach which at least works from our perspective. And that is essentially a programmatic approach. We don't feel it makes a lot of sense to go to these global finance, climate finance mechanisms on a project-by-project basis. We often get a lot of requests from municipalities, to say, look, we want support for this particular project. And, there's very strong merits, there's a very strong climate argument, but the amount of effort and resources required to access that funding on a project basis, it just does not allow us to do that. So what we've been doing, and I think this goes back to 2015, when we were first accredited with the GCF, is to design specific programs across key sectors, mostly aligned to DBS's mandated sectors, because that allows us to also co-finance with GCF. So we want to use blended finance mechanisms. I think the other thing I wanted to highlight is very often there is this notion that with climate finance, it's going to have to be grant funding. The expectation is grant funding. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case. There is definitely a role for grant funding and grant finance, but what we've seen is in recent years, it's been extremely difficult to justify grant finance. So we have to acknowledge that there has to be a different way of funding climate interventions in a sustainable manner, and look at the likes of climate finance as being catalytic, and finding other ways of funding these projects beyond just grant funding. So we've tried to blend grants with other sources of concessional finance, and designing these initiatives across a key sectors. And maybe later I'll talk about some examples that we've used or developed over the last few years across the water sector. I think yesterday we had a side event around water reuse, which is specifically for municipalities. We want to ensure that we have climate resilient municipalities that are able to deal with issues around water scarcity. We're looking at embedded generation as an example, where we want to ensure there's energy security. And that again is very much aligned to the approach that we've adopted, where we want to access climate finance to support specific sectors, to ensure that cities are able to respond to the challenges of climate change. I think I'll leave it at that for now, and then maybe later I can maybe go into a bit more details around specific examples, practical solutions that we believe could work. I think this COP, previous COPs has always been talk about commitments and we want to do this, we want to do that, and I think we're now at a stage where people want to see evidence on the ground on what's actually happening, and we can maybe share some examples as we go through the session. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mohammed. So what are we hearing, if I may just summarize? One, a programmatic approach works. Two, it must be differentiated. In other words, it must speak to the specificity of that particular environment. Thirdly, there must be some blending that takes place in terms of the financing. But what is said is that grants are not always helpful as a mechanism, perhaps not on their own anyway. Okay, thanks very much. Let me now introduce Roland, who is going to make his own provocative statements from his side. Roland, over to you. You also have your 5 to 7 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think I just want to start with this quote. I make bold to say that South Africa is a nation of two economies, and if not for the personal vicissitudes and interests of the individuals, one of these economies can access all the amenities and privileges available in the country. The other economy, unfortunately, is still burdened by inequality, unemployment, underemployment, gender-based violence, etc., etc., etc. A lot has improved, but a lot of work still needs to be done. And almost everything that has improved thanks to the government. The private sector, unfortunately, has been invisible and really has been doing everything to slow down this process. If we think about it, the 5% richest South Africans, almost exclusively white, owns 75% of everything in South Africa. If we think back a few months ago during the Durban floods, which caused almost $2 billion worth of destruction, almost everybody that was affected was black. Why is this so? It is because of where these people can afford to get housing. And if we think about it as well, a lot of the infrastructure that was damaged has not yet been rebuilt. And this speaks to a number of things. We think that climate change is going to happen. Climate change is already happening. It is already having major impacts in South Africa. But unfortunately, we do not yet have a kind of national playbook to respond to some of these challenges that are already happening. Unfortunately, too often, it is municipalities that have to do the heavy lifting on their own without the people who caused this problem. Unfortunately, too often, it is the poor, it is women, it is the majority black population that lives in very difficult circumstances that has to do the heavy lifting. And so a number of things really need to happen for this situation to change. The first one really is that for preparation, municipalities really need to start skilling people and identifying people specifically for climate purposes. And these are the climate officers at municipal level. Secondly, municipalities also need to start working together to push the national government, one, to have a national playbook, which is a national response plan, and secondly, to start allocating money specifically for this purpose. Thirdly, I'm sure many people here did not pick this up, but there were many suicides in the 2010s, really in farms where farmers could no longer survive. It was getting too hot, it was getting too dry. And the reason for this, for the suicides and so on, is because there are specific aspects of climate change that we are not yet taking into account, which should become a priority. The fact that we need to monitor carefully and put things in place before they happen, anticipation. And some of this can happen within the National Council of Provinces. Fortunately, Minister Godongwana recently said, and this was right after the floods in Durban, I now believe it now, climate change is real. Also, we need to start within our education system ensuring that everybody knows about this problem. And Francophone municipalities are already working together to access even more funds at international level. Municipalities need to work to try to access this pots of money, let me not say pot because there are many, pots of money that are becoming available to municipalities all around the world. There is a famous author who wrote a book, If Mayors Could Rule the World. Mayors really have a lot of the work, but unfortunately, I mean, you can also see, for example, provinces like Mpumalanga, which provide most of the basis for that South Africa's electrification. But you can see the conditions under which historically they designed a partners system, put this population, which has been providing the country with all these resources, in perpetual darkness. And so we also need to accelerate the ending of energy poverty, because this really is an important step to ending South Africa's economic apartheid. Think about this, and this is really where I'm going to end. Think about it. In South Africa, over the recent months, there has been a kind of energy miracle. Most of us do not think about it this way, but an energy miracle has happened in the sense that the upper middle class, between 2019 and 2023, South Africa was the biggest destination of inverters and solar panels and so on, and the upper middle class set up about 6,000 megawatts worth of electricity. I need you to think about this carefully. This is double DRC's entire generation capacity. But all of this is happening in rich households. So if you walk through rich households, Hyde Park and so on, there is no load shedding. It is specifically the poor who still bear the brunt of all of this. And so one of the reasons why we come to COP should be to ensure that the resources that we need go to provinces like Mpumalanga, Northwest, Limpopo, etc., a lot more than to some of the provinces that already have capacity, Gauteng, Western Cape, and so on. We also need to ensure that some of these municipalities have the capacity, one, for the officers to be available, two, for the playbook to be there when disaster strikes, three, to work and coordinate at local and national level to access the funds that exist at national and international level. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Roland. So what's coming out is there's an energy miracle, but it's not just enough as yet. I suspect when we segue back, I'm going to ask you to unpack that for us in a much more practical way. As Mohammed said, when he comes back, he's going to be talking to much more practical issues to do. But I think what is interesting in your input is this tale of two economies in one country. Quite interesting how it is that we actually have an opportunity to make just in transition just, to bring justice through the just energy. I think it's quite important, colleagues, to highlight three other factors that he makes mention of. One, there's a higher frequency with which incidents of climate change are happening. Secondly, there's greater intensity. People do make mention of what happened in Durban, but I think 3 years or 4 years previous to that, the Gauteng province also saw floods for the first time in years. So that was both frequency and intensity. Thirdly, what we're also experiencing in the country is the multiplicity of climate change related events at the same time. Just 2 or 3 months ago, at the same time that everybody was looking at floods in Cape Town, exactly during that 2 weeks, there were fires in the Free State and in the Northern Cape. And if I'm not mistaken, there were also floods in the Eastern Cape. And yet, there were parts of the Northwest that were beginning to experience intense drought. All of these three happening at exactly the same time. So, Thokozile, as a municipal practitioner, one of the things that Roland is talking about is how it is that government, I suspect you're talking more Roland, about the national sphere is making all efforts to support the local spheres of government, the subnational, so to speak. Are we harnessing this, Thokozile? Do we have the skills? So provocatively, as you introduce yourself, perhaps you may want to touch on that. Thanks. Over to you.
Thank you very much. My answer would be the heat is on at local governments. We are on a day-to-day basis having to face community members who want solutions. And the anticipation and the expectation of the community member is that as long as you are in that office, you are capacitated enough, either financially, technically, or in any form that you are able to respond to the needs of the community on the ground. A week before I came to Dubai, we had flooding in Emalahleni and in Hendrina. For the very first time, the numbers were huge, where you had more than 100 households affected in less than 30 minutes. It tells you how intense the environment is now responding to some of these things that we want to be very technical about and forget about the people who are on the ground. And the most affected were the vulnerable. It were the women, the children, the disabled, the people who live in the informal settlements, and the people who are in the RDP houses. And for us, all that we could do, unfortunately, is to count the numbers, submit a report, and wait for some miracle from province or from national to send us funding to be able to respond. And that takes a form of a study whereby you walk house to house, you check and you quantify what the damage could be. Then you have also to move to the Department of Human Settlements for collaboration, get into another Department of Social Development for another collaborative man. And in that process, the people are not getting any help. In that very same time, you don't even have spaces where you can move them, either in quantities or big or small quantities, you can't move them. The other challenge that we have seen is that when we respond, in our plans we have tarpaulins where we would house the people for that particular time. But now they also become prey to those that are abusive. There are cases of rape that come when people have been moved to those shelters, and there are so many abuses that then develop from that particular space. So yes, in terms of capacity, we are not capacitated. We need capacity. The capacity is very minimal, and in some spaces, it's not even there. And secondly, you'll need to find means of saying, how do we then bring capacity into locals without increasing the budget of human resource at the local municipalities. So it is very important that there should be those blended financial means that are brought in, and they cannot come alone. They should come with data, they should come with information, they should come with knowledge. The issue of us having to, I'll give a very funny example, run to DBSA, all of us as separate municipalities, and it looked like we are competing for finances. It cannot be a norm, because we are not there to catch the best or the best worm of the day, but we are having situations on the ground that demand probably this BSA, if they've got employees that have the know-how to handhold those that are in municipalities and say, this is the kind of a business plan we're looking for. And now that we are also working on a district model platform, where we need to then look at either citywide or district-wide interventions that would ensure that we are not only looking at a separate program in one municipality or in one area, but we are looking at an inclusive business plan that would cover everyone. Hence, I'm saying we need data, we need information, we need knowledge. We need to be able to access information that is sitting at CSIR, access information at Stellenbosch University, and any other space where there is information, and inform our business plans properly in a manner that when we intervene, also the people on the ground are able to play. Lastly would be that as we bring in those interventions, the people that are affected should be given a voice and a space to play in the intervening means, because it can't be technocrats only who are sitting in their offices together with politicians who decide on the final means of intervention. And also, our challenge is that as we transition, the culture, the norm, the traditions, they are transitioning. What is it that we're bringing along? How do we engage the local traditional leaders? They are the people who are living with these people and see them change. For instance, in Mpumalanga, we have abantu abaya ekoteni most of the time. If the initiation schools, it means when the seasons change, they will also affect the season of initiations. And when that happens, what is it that we do, and how do we incorporate that into the just transition process in order to make sure that nobody's left behind? Our traditions do not die, our cultures are not diminishing, but we are also moving backwards to the traditions and the cultures and the teachings of our elders, which kept us at below the temperatures that we are now facing. Because at some point, it was not like this. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Thokozile. Mayor Mtsweni, excuse the pun, but you sit at the coal face of this. Not only is your region coal dependent, and there have been calls for the last 28 years of international and national and locally based conversations on how we transition away from a coal-based economy. So you are directly affected in one way or the other. When that shift finally happens, the assumption is that there would have been a different and much more sustainable base. As a political leader, the impact of these events on societies, the direct impact, but also institutionally, how do we change? How are you changing the institution itself? How are you responding institutionally? Talking about both capacity and the capability. Capacity meaning the engineers and the skills that you have, but capability meaning the institutional know-how that is there. That includes both the public and private sector institutions. What are you experiencing at the moment?
Greetings to you, Chairperson, and fellow panelists and delegates present in this session. Really, it's true, Chair, that I'm at the coal face of everything. All the views that were raised here by both my panelists who have already spoken impact directly on my municipality. Coming from the district where Thokozile comes from, with 6 municipalities, whereby we have 2 of them which are rural, which is Tembisile-Hani and my municipality, Dr. J.S. Moroka, affected by the triple challenges of unemployment, and inequality, and poverty. When we're talking about these issues, then they affect us very much. But Chair, I must say that after we have had these new states, also the growth that is there from the municipalities are very much a question that we should talk to. Chairperson, coming back to what we have said to me, there is a variation in the levels of familiarity with the concept of just transition amongst various municipalities and affected groups, and there are different views. You have also heard today that there are really different views from the speakers who have already spoken today. Furthermore, even when various affected parties agree on a set of outcomes, there is not always agreement on how to achieve them. Chairperson, we have to acknowledge that the roles, positions, and demands of the main stakeholder groups around a just transition are complex and consistently evolving. However, Chair, there are many shared concerns among stakeholders covering issues such as loss of jobs, loss of revenue for municipalities, issues around pollution and climate change. Those are the issues that are also affecting us as rural municipalities in particular. However, stakeholders usually place different emphasis on these concerns, which tend to reflect their core mandates. A key common perspective, Chairperson, among stakeholders is that municipalities will need financial assistance to be able to meaningfully partake in local just transition. As my colleagues have already said, that it is going to impact on us very much, and about the challenges that we're having as municipalities of not being able to raise revenue in some instances, because how can you raise revenue to the people that I've already mentioned, those who are not working, those who are in poverty, but we're expected to do that. So that's why we have to ensure that we get other means of ensuring that we get this revenue. To date, international climate finance has been predominantly focused on national governments, making it difficult for local government to directly access these funds, despite the critical role they play in meeting climate goals. In addition, Chairperson and my fellow panelists, research in South Africa on how to finance the just transition has been almost entirely aimed on transitioning the energy sector within the national context. Those are the views we're sharing with you. Municipalities that are in the front line of the transition, like myself, require a reliable and just transition with a balanced approach between the pursuit of emissions reduction and ensuring energy security. Chairperson, focusing solely on rapid and inappropriate managed transition for emissions reduction could have an unintended consequence of burdens to municipalities, including making the energy grid less reliable and more expensive. I've talked about the people that were governing in our municipalities, people who are going to be very much impacted when this happened. The loss of jobs, if mines are going to be closing down, just imagine what's going to happen. So, which means we have to go back to our indigenous systems. We're going to be teaching our people how to use a coal down, how to use other means of sources, ensuring that they use energy. But this is going to take time, and in the situation where we are now, it's going to be a bit difficult because those things we're talking to are no more there to ensure that we teach our people. The JEP implementation should not only focus on decarbonization, but also about developing country imperatives associated in ancillary projects which create jobs and facilitate the transition should also be considered. Chairperson and delegates, it is with this reason that municipalities need to be able to directly access multiracial and international climate funds to fund their transfers of these funds from the national governments. In addition to what we have already said, they need to be properly included in transition planning exercises and plans that focus on how to finance the just transition. Chairperson, funds, as well as multiracial funds such as the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and Green Environmental Facility, and municipalities need to be mobilized to access these. In continuing with this topic, to ensure alignment of financing with a just transition approach, financing should be unlocked for those objectives, programs that are already with the municipality strategies and plans that contribute to the benefit realization of a just transition. At a local level, these include but are not limited to municipality integrated development plans. You all know these plans that we're having for 5 years, and then we review them every year to ensure that we include our communities in the planning that we're having. These include but are not limited to municipal plans, I've talked about them, and then master plans, energy strategies, resilience strategies, and climate change action plans. It is also important to clarify and be transparent about the types of funding instruments available to municipalities. Making an example is that the concessional loans, the grants, blended finance instruments, technical assistance fund, those are the ones we can mention, and associated terms and conditions, because they don't just come, they always come with conditions that sometimes are not able to adjust to, but we have to take those terms and conditions. Also, Chairperson, on the types of projects that will be considered as part of the current Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, the limitations of the funding and the financing timeframes, especially in the context of the mandates of local government. This is inclusion of the fair and transparent selection criteria of the evaluation and awards of proposal received from local government. This must, Chairperson, ultimately ensure that the impact of maximized, especially in municipalities that are in the head of this energy transition. Chairperson, we must look at how this happened and take care and ensure that this care should be taken to ensure that the proposed financing enhances local energy security through diversification of geographical sources, technologies, contracting strategies, and funding mechanism. Lastly, Chair, the returns of investment received from any investment made by the Just Energy Transition should be ring-fenced and allocated as a suitable source of funding to top up and expand energy subsidies in municipalities, whether the free basic electricity subsidy or the free basic alternative energy subsidy. Chairperson, this is to counter the declining ability of municipalities to cross-subsidize services as more wealthy customers defect from the municipal grid, whether fully or partially. Chairperson, we have also asked a question that I will quickly respond to, that municipalities need various partners on board to support efforts to secure funding. These include, amongst others, the National Treasury, Department of Trade and Industry, and Competition, Department of Transport, DFFE, and other departments, including ESCOM, to ensure proper, coherent implementation whilst adhering to reporting and monitoring evaluation. Chair, we're also saying that they also need relevant provincial departments in order to potentially enable a regional approach to transition infrastructure that may benefit more than one municipality. In closing, Chair, the private sector, including leaders and service providers, ensuring that there is capacity to deliver project, donors and partners who have necessary expertise to implement and can offer guidance, who can leverage off the initial funding. We're talking also about vulnerable workers, communities, and impacted groups, academia, and key through leaders and civil society that are critical interest groups on matters of climate change. Chair, in closing, we're saying that as a municipality and as a district, this transition should not leave us behind. It must walk with us, no matter how slow we are. But we're saying the people that we're leading are people that must be made aware must know about things that are happening around them. There must be nothing for them without them. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mayor Mtsweni. When we come back, I'm going to request you to have just applied your mind to sharing with us the how part of your last sentence. How is the municipality mobilizing academic institutions to find the science towards responding to the change? How is the municipality working with traditional leadership? Thokozile was saying that traditional ways of living are being impacted upon by climate change. How is the municipality mobilizing, conscientizing, educating society so that it's not seen as only a formal municipal response, but it's an all of society, all of us together responding to climate change? I think those are very critical questions that will come back to you when we have an opportunity. Mayor Pukunzi, unfortunately for you, you come from one of the smallest municipalities in South Africa, that's in the Free State province. For your sins, your colleagues that are political leaders in Salga have not only said be responsible for municipality, but they also say represent local government as a sector in parliament. So you sit in the National Council of Provinces. They then say, further to that, you will champion a working committee that's looking at climate change and environmental issues, which means you operate from a ward level up to an international level. Help us through, how do you do this? What messages do you posit in all these spheres, and how do you make sure that they are like a spine that is unbroken and messaging is actually effective?
Thank you so much, moderator. Good morning to my fellow Pavionians. Good morning to the delegates in the House. I am going to start to say everybody seated here, it's a constituency in our municipalities. That's where I'm going to start. And as constituencies in our municipalities, we are obliged by the Constitution to render services to everybody seated here in an effective and efficient manner, because we are the sphere of government that is closest to the people. The effects of climate change, disasters, and transition affects our own communities, of which of them are people seated in this particular house. Now, how do we navigate between all these things? Is to make sure that we take everybody along. The transition as it happens, I want to focus on transition because we attempt to defocus ourselves from the fact that transition is not evolved from climate change. They work together, they are hand in glove. But we must not only focus again on just energy transition. The transition says to us we need to do things differently from what we used to do as municipalities. That's the message that we take as we go to National Council of Provinces, as and when we go to the National Working Group. But what is critical and important is that all the decisions that are taken at both national, province, and anywhere else, the implementation therefore happens at local sphere of government. Then you said that I'm from the small municipalities. In South Africa, we have about 257 municipalities, about 4,500 wards that all of you comes from. And in those wards, there are different kind of communities that lives there. You've got the rich community, you've got the poor of the poorest, you've got the ones that are in the middle class, you've got the one that doesn't have anything, those are the destitute. Others are residing in an informal settlement, of which is also a challenge to municipalities. Now, what we do is to advocate and lobby to say local government must be best positioned, must be empowered. I said we've got different sizes of municipalities. Majority of people and nationals and provinces and international level, when we speak, we only speak about the metros, the cities, and the secondary cities. We forgot that the responsibility in terms of the Constitution It does not say that this is a small municipality, then therefore when you render services, these are the kind of services that you need to render. We are expected to render services equally, effectively, and efficient in the same way. So that is the mandate that we are saying. But before maybe I conclude, I need to say this. In terms of our own constitution of South Africa, when the disasters hits, they hit at the municipal level. And in terms of National Disaster Act, it says that the responsibility is a core function that is dually carried by both province and national. Ours as local municipality is only to evacuate and inform our communities. The funding, therefore, it lies with your province and national. We need to make application, and it's a challenge. Issues of funding for municipalities, it's a critical challenge for municipalities. And then again, we are told that DBSA is not going to give us grants. Let me go to the issue that is going to be thorny to many of you. In terms of the white paper on local government 25 years ago, it was said that municipalities will be able to collect revenue, municipalities will be effective, municipalities will be efficient. But all of us, we know that that is not a true reflection of what is the scenario on the ground. Because we are expected to collect revenue from those people that are unable to pay for their services, from those people that are able to do anything for themselves. Equally, we've got an equitable share that is not equitable. It is given to municipalities to say it will meet halfway the municipalities to be able to render services, but it is not sufficient. So those are the challenges that one always raises when we get to the National Council of Provinces to say, please, let us relook in the funding models of spheres of government, especially local government. We need to review that, because if and only if we are not going to do that, we are setting local government for a failure. We are saying local government must fail, local government must be in a corner doing nothing. And everybody else here is expecting us to render services to them, to give them water, to give them electricity, to provide roads for them. And it becomes a challenge when these disasters hits, because our people are unable to access your health facilities and any other services. And it becomes a problem to municipalities, because when those disasters are there, our people are unable to pay for services. Our people equally are unable to do anything else that they can do for themselves. And that creates a challenge for municipalities. And then what we are doing, it's for us to encourage our people to riot and start to have a little hope in us, because everybody says we are useless, but we are not useless. We need to deal with the issue of funding for municipalities. It is critical and important. Let us review the funding model so that municipalities, all municipalities can be able to render services, all municipalities, irrespective of the size. We must not be skewed when we fund municipalities. We must do all the services equally, irrespective of the sizes of these municipalities, because it is very critical and important for all of us. So we navigate between all this, because what is critical and pushing us is for the love of us to serve those communities. We feel their pain. We are with them day in, day out. Nobody else can speak better for our communities but ourselves. And it is not only communities, even workers in those municipalities, when they are affected, it is our challenge as municipalities to make sure that they are well taken care of. The last issue that I want to speak to is that our municipalities must not be turned into ghost towns because of the transition. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Mayor Pukunzi. So the role of local government is quite specific. Move people at times of disaster. 2, keep the communication going, create the hope for a solution. But you can't do that without proper coordination from others, and where there's a clear role for everybody else to play. Neither can you do that without the requisite financing that goes with that. I'm going to come back to my panel, and I think because of the time limits for your closing remarks, where I'm asking each and every one of you to be much more practical in the solutions that you intend to posit in this conversation. But before we do that, I just want to see if there's anyone from the audience that wants to say something in response to anything that may have come out of the panel, which you wish the panel could also respond to. Just by show of hands, one person. Okay. Feel free to introduce yourself if you have the desire. And there's two. I see the second hand going. Three. Okay, I'm going to limit audience input to those 3 hands. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. My name is Mzila Mtenjane, and I'm the CEO of the Minerals Council. I think first and foremost, I feel for the panel in terms of each of the expressions. From a Minerals Council perspective, they are a key stakeholder. So I think in my contribution and questions, I will really be wanting to be constructive. I think from what I've heard so far, it's a pity that we've had to travel so far to actually have this conversation, because I think the most important thing in terms of the structure of government between local, province, district, and national is a critical one, which I've heard in my previous engagements. And what that does actually need to be resolved, because it's one of the key impediments to development. And I think it's a conversation, I don't know, within the political or government structures that really does need to be taken a little bit more seriously. The other comment is that I'm pleased that there was the mention of the fact that we need to be mindful of the fact that actually what we need to do in this context of climate change and transitioning is marginally different to what actually local government should be doing as part of its job in as far as development is concerned. So I don't think we should speak of the work that is required on climate change and just transition as if it's something new and phenomenal. It's something that we should have been doing, something that we need to be doing. And one of the key things that I want to put forward to all of us that I'm actually becoming much more aware of in terms of responding to climate issue is the issue of leadership integrity. There are many challenges with our local government. There are many challenges with our government. And I think given where we've come from, we are seriously handicapped in as far as being able to respond constructively to the challenges of climate change. Because we haven't got the basics in place, you know, the added challenges of climate change are really becoming quite overwhelming. And so maybe just a question then to DBSA. You mentioned that the financing that is coming through is actually expected to be paid back. So it's not just grants. And so it's assuming that there is some level of economic activity that is going to be generating revenue and that revenue coming back to pay back. What are some of the assumptions perhaps that you wanting to see from local government and district government in as far as economic activity in order for the financing to come through? Because it's not just grants, but it's going to be loans. And we're seeing that with the $8.5 billion as well that was lent. And then a question to the government officials. I have a good understanding or somewhat of an understanding in terms of local and district government. Just your perspective on this district development model and the role that you think it can play in as far as assisting you with some of these challenges. And then Roland, a question to yourself. You had a very interesting opening in terms of the role of private sector. I just wanted to reconcile for me the statement you made around private sector, or the absence of private sector on the one hand, and the absence of economic playbook on the other, and how the two, you know, can potentially play together, and the role that you would see of the private sector going forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm sure each and every one of our panelists are picking up questions that are directed to themselves. Let me take the second question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I am Mbolayane Mbodi. I am from NUMSA. I just want to check with okay. I say I mustn't hold it at some. Yeah. Look, what are the chances of poorer municipalities with regards to getting proper funding in order to deal with sustainable development on the other hand, and also deal with climate devastation, or let me just say adaptation. On the other, if it is going to be loans, how can that even come to reality when there is no revenue to talk of? And the other second question is the one that talks to potentially the other municipalities where there is going to be disinvestment from fossil, disinvestment from coal, at whatever speed that the country is moving. Question is, what is there provisioned for the possible turn of that particular municipality into a ghost town? The context of that is, you know, the residential areas have got houses have got people who have come to do work. But if there is no longer work that talks to the fossil, what happens to the value of the houses and what happens to the people coming? Would they really want to stay there and contribute rates? And what has been provisioned? Do you know if there's anything provisioned for those that possibly will turn into ghost town? Thank you.
Thanks very much. And perhaps let me just make that same question slightly more complex. So you move from the premise that this is about poorer municipalities. The transition is not just going to affect only poorer municipalities from a revenue base. If you think about it, our transitioning out of the fossil fuel means bigger municipalities. If you take the car industry that is based in eThekwini, in the Nelson Mandela Bay, in the Gauteng, they are also going to be affected in one way or the other. And indirectly, those households, when they lose their revenues, the knock-on effect is going to be on the municipality. So it's an entire belt. So it's not just, we shouldn't focus it just only on the poorer municipalities as we formulate a response. But thanks very much for that question. Thanks. Your third and last question. Thank you.
There we go. Hello. My name is Claire Pengeli. I'm from an organization called Green Cape. In my experience, one of the major barriers to attracting climate-funded projects within local municipalities is that really initial phase, kind of let's call it pre-feasibility, and the capacity of municipalities to be able to build projects to which they can actually then access those climate funds. So before we even talk about going to DBSA and accessing project preparation funding, for which there is a substantial amount, it's that really kind of beginning of, okay, we can see there's disasters coming down the line in my municipality. How do I actually build out a project and a concept that's actually going to be able to tackle it? And who's going to be able to help me figure this out and actually build it into something that's probably going to be a collaborative effort, right? So it's not going to be just simply one municipality, but a number of municipalities that would need to tap into a variety of climate finance mechanisms. And I guess I want to check that reflection with you, that is something that when we think about grant funding and where it's needed, it's getting that project pipeline at an early stage actually up and running, so we can start tackling some of those funding challenges. And whether it's the funding eventually is grant or loan based, it will very much depend on the capacity ultimately of the municipality to pay back or to be able to access the funds. And then I think maybe that also leads me to my question and challenge, I guess, to DBSA. So what do you see your role in this? Because I think that from our perspective, we'd love to see you kind of reaching a little bit earlier and trying to really work much more on the municipal scale in building out those project pipelines. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that third and last question from the audience. So what we're going to do, again, because of time, I'm going to allow my colleague, Mtobeli, at the end of the session or towards the end of the session, just to sweep what it is that we're getting and harvesting out of these conversations without being conclusive about it, but just to say what's coming out of this conversation. And one of the things that I think is coming out is that this conversation, it seems like it's a pity that it took place here, but I think these conversations have been going on. But I think what we need to do is to lift the platform so that they are heard across, and they should not be limited to some of the constituencies. It's an additional point that I want to make. Mohammed, let me hand over to you. I think you've spoken, you've heard your counterparts in the panel, you've heard from the audience. What say they?
No, I think it's a very interesting discussion, and obviously some very valid points being raised by the municipalities in terms of issues around capacity, issues around revenues for these climate interventions, reliance on non-grant type of instruments, and the conditions that comes with this type of finance. So I think these are all extremely valid points, and it's something we've been grappling with as well over the last few years. I think my first point is when it comes to climate finance, as DBSA, our only source of grant funding is the likes of your GCF and GEF. We don't have grant funding in terms of, we raise our capital from the market, and our funding is quite expensive, to be blunt. So the only way we can intervene is through our accreditation with these UNFCCC finance mechanisms. The challenge is these mechanisms are becoming quite stringent around grant funding. I think that's a reality, and it's not like the early days of the GCF where they were dishing out grants for large projects, both mitigation, adaptation projects. We all know that adaptation is a lot more difficult to fund with non-grant instruments, but this is a challenge we faced, and I can give you some real examples. Recently, over the last few years, we developed a program for South Africa, for South African municipalities, around solid waste management, targeting under-resourced municipalities. And the study that we did around that program was the support we require is kind of 100% grant funding. We went to the GCF, they unequivocally told us it's not possible. You can have a significant grant component focusing on technical support. There could be aspects of grant funding that could be used to catalyze this initiative, but they wanted us to go back to these municipalities, and again, your poorer municipalities, to understand what is their ability to absorb highly concessional finance. So they're still pushing for this, a concessionality approach, and you have to justify, the grant component. So that's a discussion we've had, with the likes of G7, and in fact, even debates around development versus climate. So they often come to us and say, look, sort out your governance issues in the municipalities before you apply for climate finance. That's been kind of a very blunt response. They say, look, you've got so many issues with these municipalities in terms of, governance issues, and yet you want us to provide grant funding. So that's a challenge we often face, even as an accredited entity, with GCF. And we say, but if that's your approach, who else can approach GCF for funding? I mean, everyone faces the same challenges or similar challenges. We recognize that, yes, it's not just about climate finance, it's also about, other issues that needs to be sorted out in order to effectively utilize the climate finance. So we do understand where they're coming from, but we also counter-argue that to say, look, there is an immediate need to address, climate imperatives. So I think the way we're trying to address these issues and challenges is to look at each municipality individually. Yes, while we look at programs, we customize the financial solutions for each municipality's needs. And we recognize that the level of concessionality and also the level of grant funding required would vary from municipality to municipality. So if you're dealing with a large city which has a very strong balance sheet, surely, the expectation of grant funding would be much less. With poorer municipalities, I think there can be a very strong justification for a high level of concessionality and also significant amount of grant funding. But this talks to the point of capacity issues with the municipalities. They need support to develop these projects. And I think you made a very valid point to say it's all good and well to have these programs for large infrastructure projects, whether it's embedded generation, water reuse, solid waste management, but if there's no capacity for these municipalities to actually do pre-visibility studies, you're not going to find a pipeline of projects. So that we've seen that in our experience with the embedded generation program, which we established with GC a few years ago. And we decided then to, and we haven't seen a lot of projects coming from municipalities, and we decided to then approach the likes of UK Pact, other funders, to actually support municipalities with pre-feasibility studies. They can then feed into project preparation and then ultimately access the funds available, from the likes of GCF and DBSA and other funders. So I think that we've certainly seen that need, and we've learned from that. And with the design of the water reuse program, which we spoke about in one of the side events yesterday, we have a dedicated facility to assist municipalities with technical support, to provide grant funding, to undertake detailed vulnerability assessments, which is often required. So I think, to cut a long story short, what is required is to understand the full funding landscape, recognizing that each municipality is different, each municipality they have their own challenges. How do we ensure that there are coordinated efforts to fill the gaps? Otherwise, municipalities will not be able to access the plenty of climate finance that is available and provide the technical assistance. And then the points raised by my fellow panelists about community engagement. When it comes to climate finance, you have to have very robust stakeholder engagement plans. Very often, these large infrastructure projects are often seen by communities as being elitist. You've got these private funders, you've got DFIs coming in. How do they get involved? And, we do have examples of trying to get communities involved with the Embedded Generation Program as an example. Part of the funding goes towards community trust in order to ensure that they have ownership of some of these projects. So I think that needs to happen more often in other sectors apart from, renewable energy. So for me, it's all about having a better understanding of what are the key gaps facing specific municipalities and coordinated efforts to fund the entire value chain. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Ma. And meaningful participation, I suspect, is the key. Roland?
Yes, so I'm going to be really quick about it. When we had a disaster in the U.S. in New Orleans, what the U.S. government did was to create very quickly a structure called FEMA, which would coordinate disaster at countrywide level. So when you have an issue, for example, and local municipalities are struggling on their own to set up tents and things like that, it should not be happening. I attended a panel with one of the SALGA directors, and we discussed this, and this was with Newsroom Africa. And one of the things that was really evident is that South Africa needs a FEMA-type organization like yesterday. Let's remember, Africa really is hitting at twice the global speed. The second thing which you alluded to earlier when I spoke about the transition that is happening in South Africa, there is a coming bloodbath. There is a coming bloodbath, and you heard Minister Gordon say this. In a very short space of time in 2023, due to the solar panels that were being set up, municipalities lost 300 million rand in a very short space. And so how do municipalities react to start getting this revenue back? Like someone was alluding to earlier, there has to be negotiations at the NCOP so that the kind of way that the money is distributed amongst provinces and municipalities changes. This is one of the reactions that needs to happen very fast. And also to the question of accessing funds, which you asked and which Thokozile also alluded to, municipalities should not be going this alone. They also need to be looking beyond DBSA and so on, in the sense that pooling has to happen. And for pooling to happen, things like the CETAs need to be transformed in the way they do their training. The universities also need to be transformed in the way they do their capacitating, so that when municipalities set up trainings, it should be done in such a way that they have the kind of capacities that they need to pool efforts. Now, to look at the contribution of the private sector and so on, I think one of the biggest challenges that we have seen, especially in rural municipalities, is the really negative role that some farms play. We have seen, for example, I don't know if any of you have seen the some of the videos that were shared about this worker who has been on this farm for almost 30 years and then summarily dismissed last week, no pay, no nothing, no ownership, no nothing. Some of these things really have to be part of the discussions that happen around the transition. I think it was a PCC commissioner who asked earlier about the ghost towns that are going to come up and so on. The discussions within the JET and the JET investment plan has to be such that within municipalities, within neighborhoods and so on, there should be neighborhood ownership, subaltern, from below ownership, cooperative type ownership of power stations, solar power stations, wind farms, and so on. So far, this is not really being discussed, and all the ownership happens somewhere else. There has to be a lot more discussions so that we avoid the ghost town scenario. And one of these really is about local community ownership, women ownership of power stations and things like that.
That's a very interesting innovation. I think we were also in one session where something similar came up, that if you're going to respond to energy poverty, then the generation should be communally owned so that you're able to directly feed incomes into the various households, and then you'll see the ripple effect. Togo?
Yeah, it's hot, I said, at the local level, because as we transition, we see now mixed forms of, I'll look only at the energy point of view. When different forms of energy comes in, it means municipalities are losing income, and when income is lost at municipal level, we're unable to maintain the roads, we're unable to develop, we're unable to do just your basic things. And when you look at it in the past, when the municipalities were established, they were just there to be enablers of economic development. But suddenly, with the just transition, we're expected to play a role to create economic activities that would then ensure that municipalities are sustainable. So we are now expected to know beyond providing services. When I entered the municipality at some point, I knew that my role was to make sure that there's water, electricity, and streets and stuff. But today, I'm expected to make sure that the community member that is supposed to pay for services has to have a job. So I need to be worried about the level of unemployment that is there in the municipality before I can give out a bill to a community member to pay that particular bill. Our list of people that are looking for houses, we are, in one of the municipalities, we're standing at 2010 list, just starting to provide housing for them. Public housing needs. We were standing at 2010, October. I remember it was October the 8th. So we're dealing with October the 8th for the rest of the year, just to make sure that those people have housing. And when you look at it, those that, if I had applied for a house back then, it means I might have been, he might have been my dad, he's old. I'm now a wife to somebody else, but I'm still staying at home, and there are children. Probably my children are now teenagers, and soon they will also be looking for housing. So our challenges are perpetual in a way that we need not only to look at just transition as only a matter of energy or any other. Probably, yeah, not just focusing on energy, because when we moved from the old system to the new current government, we transitioned. But there are elements that we left behind, like your housing needs that were there, that like urbanization, where people moved into urban spaces and they started flocking the urban areas. You look at your Alexandra, for example. As much as the city of Joburg can move people, they are still there. The same happens in Cape Town. The same now is happening in our towns. In Mpumalanga, for instance, in the Nkangala district, we have more than 3% of people moving into our towns every year. And when you compare that with the entire country, we are at a higher level, receiving more people because of poverty migration. People are anticipating that Mpumalanga has got mines, will have jobs. But when they came to Mpumalanga, jobs are being cut because of climate change and also because of decommissioning of some of the mines because of whatever reasons that may be. So at the end of the day, it brings back the burden to municipalities. And it comes back to saying, do we have the capacity now to become the economic catalysts? We are not trained to be economic catalysts. So we need those that can catalyze the economy to be part and parcel of what we are doing on a day-to-day basis. So our partnership is no longer about providing service. It's about creating livelihoods, maintaining livelihoods, ensuring that our communities are healthy, our communities are safe, and our communities are sustainable. So at the end of the day, we need to restore also the trust and the rapport between the municipality and the people, because with anything that happens, people run to the municipality. All of us here, when anything happens, the first question you ask, you don't say, where is the provincial department of what? You want to go to the municipality because you expect that the municipality should have answers. And then, how are we capacitated in terms of finances, in terms of human resource, and in terms of the technical know-how on the ground, so that we are able then to create a livable space that is good for everyone to live in. Thank you.
So in other words, inability to respond adequately to loss and damage leads to the delegitimization of the state. Effectively, that's what it is. Okay. Ma'am Tweni, I did ask you about
No, thank you very
bringing
much.
other stakeholders into the fold. Traditional leadership, in particular, I have sort of emphasized as well.
Yes, Mr. Moderator, thank you very much. But I want to start by saying the buzzword here is collaboration. All of us must come together. All of us seated here come from a municipality. You can be from Johannesburg, you can be from New York, but where you end up is in a municipality. So you're talking about capacity, talking about other things, but who must do that? You talked about academic institutions. We're saying that Mohammed has briefly touched on that one about the plans. The plans are so much cumbersome. So for us to be able to come up with these plans that are needed, let the academic institutions come in and assist us. I'm sure that those will even assist them in coming up with their thesis that they will check the universities. So also, in order to deal with the matters of the load shedding these days, we have a lot of people who are coming to us. I'm coming to the point of traditional leadership who wants to assist us in coming up with these plans where they want to build a solar plant. So for us as municipalities is to have these collaborative ways and the signing of MOAs with the traditional leaders to ensure that we get land, enough land, because one plant needs a lot of hectares, so that we work together and to make them aware that they are leading people. So for our people to be safe and to understand climate change issues, we must have this land made available to us. So also, we're saying that you also talked about the ghost towns. We're saying for us to be able to ensure that we have these towns not becoming ghost towns, we must ensure that we take care of those families who are there, in ensuring that we come with these good plans of ensuring that there's this good transition, of ensuring that they are taken good care of. The last point that I wanted to say, I did say that the buzzword is that all of us must come together and ensure that we do these things and ensure that there's this capacity we're talking about and the understanding by our people. Last month in November, we were hit by a heat wave. It was very hot in South Africa. And that's when our people started to say, but what's happening? because some of them were sitting under the shade, some of them were doing this. In doing that, we're teaching our people to come with this value chain. We're also waiting for your funds and your difficult conditions, DBSA. We're teaching our people to ensure that there's greening, they must plant trees, they must also plant vegetables. We must have this value chain in our municipalities where we have planting, we're having storage, we're having processing, and we're having storage. I mean, I've talked about storage, and where we can get all of this so that we don't just sit back and wait for these grants and their difficult conditions, so that our people know that ourselves also coming to responding to your question, we cannot sit back. We must also come up with plans on how we're going to ensure that we deal with matters of climate change and disasters that come with climate change. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Chairperson of the working group, you will have the last word from my panel, and I will ask Kumto to just give us a brief summary of what are we harvesting coming out of here.
I got quite a few things that I want to raise before I close. Let me speak to the issue of the DDM. All of us, we know that we used to have the intergovernmental relations.
Is the district development
model, for those ones that don't know. The DDM depends on the appetite of the champions. That's the dilemma with the DDM. And I'm going to cite it in an intergovernmental relations scenario. We had provinces that were hit by the disasters. And municipalities and communities of those provinces, I'm going to cite examples, were left alone. You have your champions in terms of DDM, but municipalities still today are left alone. I'm speaking about Jagersfontein in the Free State. I'm speaking about the bridge in the Eastern Cape. I'm speaking equally about the KZN. Now, those are all good concepts that we are having that needs to assist us in collaborating and working together. But often, municipalities are left alone to rehabilitate after all disasters that had hidden. But what is also critical and important, there's a need to look at the funding mechanism to climate-proof municipal infrastructure. Why do we say this? This includes rebuilding better in response to destruction of infrastructure because of climate-related disasters. It includes funding the higher cost of opting for more climate-resilient infrastructure designs when investing in new infrastructure. We are saying we are transitioning. Transitioning means that instead of us building the bridge the old way that we used to build a bridge, we need to build it in a climate-proof way. And that is going to be very costly for us as municipalities with limited budget because we are relying on the grants from national because with DBSA, it's already fallen down. They need quite a lot of things. They will look into your books and say, no, in terms of your ages report, you are not qualifying. These are the factors that we are looking into. So they play as if they are a private bank, but they're a part of us as government. So they need to really look into ways of making us to be able to be viable because we are not in competition with DBSA. We need everybody, we need to collaborate. But equally, we cannot do it alone as local government. We need everybody. We need to start to speak many messages with one voice, because that is the only thing that is going to help us. And in respect of disaster readiness and response, it is questionable whether we are ready as a country and municipalities. And this speaks to what I raised about the funding model to say you'll have to apply. And then all of us, when we open our mouth, we'll say that municipalities are returning funding to the national treasury. But the most culprit is your province because COP28 is the one that is charged with the responsibility to distribute the funding for the disaster. So all of us, we need to go back home and start to speak and start to look into the ways that we are going to make ourselves effectively for the betterment of the lives of these communities because we've got good policies, the implementation thereof is a disaster. And with municipalities, I need to close with this one. I'm speaking in response to my municipality. You are expected to have a chartered accountant. You are expected to have your engineers and everybody else that are qualified. But as municipalities, those people, if you pay them, you have to pay them about 1.5 million. Where can you get a chartered accountant with 1.5 million? It is very unfair to municipalities. So before we judge municipalities, let's put ourselves in the shoes of those municipalities and understand really what is local government. Ours is to lobby and advocate on behalf of our member municipalities, and we will never tire to do that in any place and any platform that we get. We are going to make sure that the voice of local government is heard and everybody else understand where we come from. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nto? In summary.
Okay, thank you, moderator. I have literally 2 minutes to try and summarize a lot of very rich discussions that have taken place here. But the panel, I think, has been quite articulate in this. So I'll try and pick a few, not more than 5, given the time that I have. I think the one thing that comes across very strongly, and I think both Mayor Mtsweni and Mayor Pugunzi are making this point, is the issue of multi-level government cooperation. That the challenge of responding to the climate crisis requires cooperation across all the spheres of government. I think that comes across very strongly. And for me, remembering that in the architecture, at least in the South African context, the architecture of the governance system was anchored on multi-level cooperation of spheres of government. I think what I'm hearing from the panel is that we need to use that much more now for us to respond to the climate crisis. The second one I heard was that in addition to vulnerability to climate change, in terms of our local communities, our local economies, the institutions themselves, which is municipalities and the economies and the communities, are also vulnerable to the response. Some response measures, for example, decarbonization, might have a negative impact on some local communities and economies, and therefore our adaptation responses must take into account how do we adapt our socio-economic development in such a way that it is not impacted so negatively, and therefore create ghost towns as part of our response to climate change. I think that's part of what I heard, particularly from the examples of Mpumalanga. Thirdly, what I heard is the need to pull the communities into all of this effort, and the acknowledgement that local government brings a possibility of being able to do that. However, in the way that we found our response, to construct our response, we need to take into account the effort that needs to be put in place in pulling the communities along in that response. Fourth, which I think is a very important point also made from the comments from the floor, is the need to adjust the governance systems to align to the fact that we are responding to a crisis. The whole governance system must adjust to that. And I picked up 2 examples that make this point. The one example was the disaster management response, or the disaster management in general. Firstly, to create a situation where you minimize the likelihood of loss of life and huge damage by taking steps to disaster-proof your socio-economic development. That, and also the response when disasters happen. I think the example was made there. So therefore there is a need for government to readjust itself, to recognize that we're going to have this as part of the climate crisis, and we need to be able to respond much more quicker. So that is one on the adjustment of the governance system. The second one, which I think came out quite strongly from the municipalities, is that the construct of the funding framework of local government was presumed a particular development situation in which municipalities would be able to raise revenues in order for them to survive and provide services. The situation of the climate crisis presents much more bigger challenge that makes that construct not to be valid anymore. So the need to review the funding framework, recognizing what the climate crisis presents is important. I think the example that came out of that is that, for example, transitioning from coal-based energy, which is a central part of the municipal funding framework. 2/3 of a typical municipality that is a distributor of electricity comes from buying bulk electricity from ESCOM and selling that electricity to consumers. When that stops, then we have lost 2/3 of the model of funding. So therefore, there is a need to review. But over and above that, I think the point we're being made is that the climate crisis, particularly for smaller municipalities, creates even a more urgent need to rethink the funding framework. So that's in the adjustment of the systems of government. Lastly, is the access to finance. I think the point that came out of here is that there are opportunities for finance, but these must be shared. We must help municipalities to understand and know what is available out there, but also recognizing that in addition to the funding that can come through via institutions such as DBSA, there may be other opportunities. However, the biggest bottleneck is fetching potential projects that can be funded through this. So there is a need, again, in the same language of working together, to work together to actually fetch potential projects that could potentially be funded into the system of funding in philanthropies, in the grant component, in the loan component. When we construct this funding, when we fetch this effectively, we then create a possibility for municipalities to access the funding. So I thought I should just mention those 5 that I am pulling out, and I hope we are all taking them away with us. Thank you.
Thanks very much. A round of applause to everybody. Firstly, in closing, I would like to thank our panel. Please, a round of applause to everybody else. Thanks very much for those insights and sharing them with us. Secondly, I would like to thank the audience for staying on as well. Clearly, this is a big issue with which we really have to open the conversation much more broadly and reach consensus, differentiated consensus, I imagine. Lastly, I'd like to apologize to the venue organizers for stealing 10 minutes more. We apologize for that, but unfortunately, that's how it had to be. But we thank you for the support and the logistics. Thanks very much, everybody.